He thought he could humiliate her in a single hearing, but he had no idea he had just stepped into a courtroom he no longer controlled. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of District Courtroom 3B, casting long reflections across the polished wooden floor as Judge Robert Whitmore adjusted his robe and scanned the docket with a faint, impatient smirk, the kind worn by a man who believed the law was not just his profession, but his personal domain. And today, his attention settled on a name he had been waiting for, Emma Carter, called forward not with neutrality, but with intention, a quiet trap disguised as routine procedure. As the clerk announced her case, a few heads in the gallery turned. Curious, sensing the subtle shift in the room's energy, Emma rose from the second row, her simple navy cardigan and neatly tied hair marking her as unremarkable at first glance. Just another citizen navigating a system too complex for most, her steps measured, calm. Almost too calm for someone about to be scrutinized under the weight of a judge known for his sharp tongue and even sharper ego. And as she approached the stand, Whitmore leaned back slightly, studying her like a teacher preparing to expose an unprepared student. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, smooth but edged with condescension. "I trust you understand the seriousness of standing before this court." A faint ripple of quiet amusement moved through a few observers, subtle but present, as if they had seen this performance before. Emma nodded once, her eyes steady, offering no immediate defense. No visible tension, just silence. And that silence, though unnoticed by most, lingered a second longer than expected. Whitmore continued, flipping through papers with exaggerated precision. "You see, too often individuals come in here thinking they can challenge the system without fully grasping how it works." He paused, letting the words hang, turning them into a quiet spectacle. "Tell me, Miss Carter, do you even understand the legal implications of your situation?" A low chuckle escaped from somewhere in the back row, quickly stifled, and for a moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a stage set for humiliation. Emma's hands remained still at her sides, her posture relaxed but not submissive, her gaze fixed forward, not on the spectators, not even fully on the judge, but somewhere steady, grounded, as if the tension in the room belonged to everyone else but her. And Whitmore, misreading that composure as uncertainty, allowed a thin smile to form, the kind that precedes a calculated remark. "I would advise," he added, leaning slightly forward, "that you keep your responses brief, clear, and within the limits of your understanding." Another pause, heavier this time, as though inviting the room to share in the assumption, and still, Emma said nothing, not yet, not when he expected it. And in that quiet, something almost imperceptible shifted, a subtle imbalance, like a scale tipping just a fraction out of alignment, but no one could quite name it. Not the clerk, not the spectators, and certainly not Judge Whitmore, who believed, with absolute certainty, that he was still in control of every word, every reaction, every outcome that would follow, unaware that the calm standing before him was not uncertainty, but restraint, not ignorance, but patience, and that the moment he chose to make her an example was the moment he unknowingly gave her the stage. The silence lingered just a moment too long after the judge's last remark, long enough for a few in the gallery to exchange glances, unsure whether they had just witnessed the beginning of a routine hearing or something far more deliberate. And as Judge Whitmore straightened a stack of documents with slow, deliberate movements, he signaled for the clerk to proceed, his tone casual but edged with quiet authority. "Let us review the matter at hand," he said, though the way he spoke made it clear. This was less about facts and more about control. Emma remained standing, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as the clerk outlined the charge, a procedural violation tied to a missed notice that Emma had already resolved weeks earlier. Yet somehow it had resurfaced, reframed, and expanded into something more serious, something that now carried implications far beyond a simple administrative oversight. And as the details were read aloud, a faint crease formed between Emma's brows, not confusion, but recognition, as if she had just identified a pattern she had seen before, somewhere, some time ago, and Whitmore watched her closely, interpreting that subtle shift as uncertainty. "You see, Miss Carter," he interjected, his voice cutting cleanly through the clerk's recitation. The law does not operate on assumptions or personal interpretations. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the bench. It operates on precision, something that requires years of training to fully comprehend. A few quiet nods came from the spectators, reinforcing the unspoken hierarchy of knowledge in the room, and Emma finally spoke, her voice calm, measured. "I understand that, Your Honor." The simplicity of her response seemed almost to invite further scrutiny, and Whitmore did not hesitate. "Do you?" he replied, raising an eyebrow. "Because from where I am sitting, it appears you failed to follow even the most basic procedural requirement." The words landed with calculated weight, designed not just to question her actions, but to diminish her credibility. And yet Emma did not react in the way he expected. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to argue prematurely. Instead, she listened, fully, as though allowing him to complete something he had already decided. And in that listening, she began to piece together the structure of what was unfolding, the timing of the notice, the language used in the filing, the unusual escalation of a minor issue into a formal hearing, each detail aligning with quiet precision in her mind, like steps in a process she had studied long ago. Whitmore continued, unaware of the shift happening beneath the surface. "This court does not entertain excuses," he said, his tone sharpening, "and certainly not from individuals who lack the expertise to properly navigate legal obligations." The statement hung in the air, heavier now, more pointed, and a subtle tension spread across the room, the kind that precedes either collapse or revelation. Emma's fingers curled slightly at her sides, not in anxiety, but in focus, and for the briefest moment, her gaze lifted to meet the judge's directly, steady, unwavering, revealing nothing yet suggesting everything. And then she lowered her eyes again, as if choosing her moment with care, while Whitmore leaned back once more, confident, composed, entirely certain that the narrative of this hearing was still his to control, unaware that with every word he spoke, he was not tightening his grip on the situation, but exposing the very framework that would soon begin to unravel in front of everyone watching. The air in the courtroom grew heavier as the judge's last words settled, not with the authority he intended, but with a quiet tension that seemed to stretch across every polished surface. And Emma stood there, still composed, still silent. Yet something in her presence had begun to change, subtle at first, almost invisible, like the shift in pressure before a storm. And Judge Whitmore, confident in his command of the room, gestured lightly with his hand. "If you have anything to say in your defense, Ms. Carter, now would be the appropriate time." His tone carried a trace of impatience now, as though he had already decided how this would end and was merely allowing her the illusion of participation. A few spectators leaned forward, expecting hesitation, perhaps even an apology, but Emma did neither. Instead, she took a small breath, steady and controlled, and spoke with a clarity that cut cleanly through the room. "Your Honor, I would like to clarify the procedural basis of this hearing." The phrasing alone caused a subtle ripple, not loud, not obvious, but enough that a few heads turned toward one another, recognizing something unexpected in her choice of words. Whitmore's expression tightened just slightly, the smallest crack in an otherwise composed demeanor. "Clarify," he repeated, as if testing the word itself. "Go ahead." Emma nodded once, her voice remaining calm, precise. The notice referenced in this matter was issued on a date that conflicts with the documented resolution already filed, which raises a question regarding the validity of the escalation. The room stilled, not completely, but enough that even the faint shuffling of papers seemed louder than before. Whitmore leaned forward again, this time with less ease. "That is not your concern," he replied quickly, almost too quickly. "The court has determined the relevance of the notice." But Emma did not retreat. She did not raise her voice. She simply continued, "With respect, Your Honor, procedural validity directly affects jurisdiction, and without proper jurisdiction, the court's authority to proceed may be compromised." The words landed differently than anything spoken before, not emotional, not defensive, but structured, deliberate, and unmistakably informed. A murmur, barely audible, moved through the back rows, and for the first time, Whitmore did not immediately respond. His fingers paused on the edge of the bench, his gaze sharpening as he studied her more closely, as if reassessing something he had dismissed too quickly. "Where did you study law?" he asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could frame it with the same control he had maintained earlier. Emma met his gaze again, steady, unflinching. "I did not present that as part of my argument, Your Honor," she replied, not evasive, but exact. And that answer, more than any legal point, shifted the balance in the room, because it revealed something he had not accounted for, not just knowledge, but discipline, the ability to stay within the boundaries of argument while quietly redefining them. Whitmore straightened in his seat, his composure returning, but not fully, not completely. "This court will proceed," he stated firmly, though the firmness now carried an undercurrent of tension, as if he were reasserting control rather than simply exercising it. Emma gave a small nod, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and as she lowered her gaze once more, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with the growing realization that what had begun as a simple display of authority was becoming something far less predictable, and that the woman standing quietly at the center of it was not being drawn into the judge's narrative, but slowly, methodically, rewriting it. The weight of her words did not fade. It settled, pressing gently but persistently against the walls of the courtroom. And for the first time that morning, Judge Whitmore did not immediately fill the silence, his eyes narrowing slightly as he flipped through the documents again, this time with less certainty, as if searching for something he had assumed would always be there. "The court has already reviewed the procedural timeline," he said, his tone firm but no longer effortless, "and determined that the matter stands." But even as he spoke, the rhythm of his authority had shifted, the confidence now carrying a trace of defensiveness, and Emma remained still, allowing the moment to breathe before responding. "Then perhaps the court can clarify how jurisdiction was established given the discrepancy in filing sequence." Her voice was steady, not confrontational, but precise, each word placed carefully, like steps on a path she had already mapped out. A faint murmur moved through the gallery again, this time less restrained, curiosity replacing earlier amusement. Whitmore's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Jurisdiction is not determined by your interpretation," he replied, leaning forward again, but the movement now felt more reactive than controlled. "It is determined by this bench." Emma inclined her head, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. "Yes, Your Honor, and that is why I am asking for clarification on the basis used." The distinction was subtle, but unmistakable. She was not arguing against authority, she was asking it to define itself, and that question, simple as it sounded, began to expose the structure beneath the surface. Whitmore glanced briefly at the clerk, a flicker of uncertainty passing so quickly it might have gone unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. A man in the second row adjusted his posture, leaning forward. A woman near the aisle stopped taking notes. The room was listening now, not for entertainment, but for something closer to truth. The notice was issued. "In accordance with standard procedure," Whitmore said, his voice tightening, "and the court finds no fault in its timing." Emma's gaze lifted again, calm, unwavering. "Respectfully, the record shows that." The resolution was filed prior to the notice being generated, which would suggest the matter had already been concluded. She paused just long enough for the words to settle. If that is the case, then the subsequent notice would lack a procedural basis. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, more focused, no longer scattered but concentrated at the center of the exchange. Whitmore's fingers tapped once against the bench, a small, controlled movement, but one that revealed more than he intended. "You are making assumptions," he said. Though the statement lacked the earlier certainty, Emma did not raise her voice, did not press forward aggressively. She simply held her position. "I am referencing the documented sequence, Your Honor," she replied, and in that moment, the shift became undeniable, not dramatic, not explosive, but precise, like a line being drawn where none had been visible before. The judge leaned back again, but this time the movement carried weight, as if he were recalibrating rather than presiding, and the courtroom, once shaped entirely by his authority, now felt balanced on something else, something quieter but far more difficult to dismiss. and as the seconds passed, it became clear to everyone watching that the narrative was no longer moving in a single direction. It was beginning to turn, slowly, deliberately, and the person guiding that turn was not the one seated behind the bench. The courtroom no longer felt like a place where outcomes were decided in advance. It felt like a structure being tested, every word now carrying weight that could no longer be dismissed with authority alone. And Judge Whitmore, sensing the shift even if he would not acknowledge it, reached for control in the only way he knew, by accelerating the process. "This line of questioning is irrelevant," he stated firmly, though the firmness now required effort. "The court will proceed to determination." But the declaration landed differently than before, not as a conclusion, but as an attempt to move past something unresolved. Emma did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. She simply spoke again, her tone unchanged. "Before determination, Your Honor, may I request that the court confirm whether the notice in question was issued manually or through automated processing?" The question was simple, almost technical, yet it introduced a detail that had not been addressed, and the room reacted in subtle ways: a shift in posture, a pause in breathing, the recognition that something specific, something verifiable, had just entered the conversation. Whitmore hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "The method of issuance does not alter its validity," he replied, though the answer did not fully meet the question, and Emma, still composed, continued. "It may not alter validity on its own, but it does affect traceability, which relates to whether the sequence of filings can be independently verified." The precision of her language narrowed the space in which the judge could respond without addressing the substance, and for the first time, the clerk looked up from the documents, uncertainty flickering across his face as he glanced between the bench and the record in front of him. Whitmore's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the desk. "The court is not required to justify internal processes to the respondent," he said, but the statement felt less like authority and more like resistance. Emma inclined her head again, acknowledging the statement while quietly advancing her point. "Understood, Your Honor. However, if the process cannot be verified, then the sequence cannot be confirmed, and if the sequence cannot be confirmed, then the basis for jurisdiction remains unclear." The logic unfolded step by step, each piece building on the last, not aggressively, not forcefully, but inevitably, like a chain that could not be broken without addressing its origin. A deeper silence settled over the room now, not the earlier silence of expectation, but one of realization, and Whitmore leaned back, exhaling slowly, his gaze shifting briefly to the side, as if recalculating. "You are attempting to complicate a straightforward matter," he said, though the words no longer carried the same weight. Emma's response came without hesitation. "No, Your Honor, I am attempting to simplify it to its foundation." And that distinction, quiet as it was, reframed everything, because it suggested that what had been presented as simple was in fact built on something unexamined, something fragile, and the courtroom, once guided entirely by assumption, now felt suspended on a single question that had not yet been answered. Whitmore's expression hardened, not with confidence, but with resolve, as if recognizing that the path he had chosen at the beginning of the hearing could no longer be followed without consequence. And as he looked back at Emma, truly looked at her for the first time, it became clear that she was no longer standing within the limits he had set for her. She had stepped beyond them, not by defiance, but by precision, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance of the room in a way that could not be undone with authority alone, and the realization, though unspoken, settled heavily, because it meant that whatever came next would not be controlled by assumption, but by truth. The question did not fade. It remained suspended in the air, quiet but immovable, and for the first time since the hearing began, Judge Whitmore did not immediately respond, his gaze shifting from Emma to the documents in front of him, then briefly to the clerk, as if searching for confirmation that had always been there before but now felt just out of reach, and the stillness stretched, not awkward, not uncertain, but deliberate, as though the courtroom itself was waiting for something to be acknowledged. Emma did not move, did not speak again. She simply allowed the silence to do what it was now doing so clearly, revealing what words could no longer conceal. And Whitmore finally exhaled, a controlled breath that carried more weight than any statement he had made earlier. "The court maintains its position," he said, but the sentence lacked the finality it once would have carried, because it did not answer the question that had been placed at its center. Emma's voice returned, calm and measured. "Then may I ask the court to confirm whether the original resolution filing is present in the record before us?" The request was precise, anchored in documentation rather than interpretation, and it narrowed the path forward even further. Whitmore hesitated again, longer this time, before turning slightly toward the clerk. "Provide the file," he said, and the clerk, who until now had moved with routine efficiency, paused for a fraction of a second before gathering the documents, flipping through them with increasing focus, the sound of paper shifting echoing more loudly than it should have in the quiet room. And as the seconds passed, something changed in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pause in movement, as if he had reached a point in the record that did not align with expectation. Whitmore leaned forward, his voice lower now, more controlled. "Well?" he prompted, and the clerk cleared his throat softly. "The resolution appears to have been filed prior to the notice issuance," he said, carefully, as though each word needed to be placed with precision, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The room shifted, the quiet turning from tension into realization, and Whitmore's expression hardened, not in authority, but in recognition, the kind that comes when something can no longer be dismissed. Emma did not react visibly, but her posture remained steady, grounded, as if this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. "Then, Your Honor," she said, her voice unchanged, "would it be accurate to say that the notice was generated after the matter had already been resolved?" The question was not confrontational. It did not accuse. It simply aligned the facts in a way that required acknowledgement. Whitmore's hand rested flat against the bench now, his fingers no longer tapping, no longer signaling control, but still, as if the movement itself had been paused, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. Not the clerk, not the spectators, not even the judge, because the answer, though unspoken, was already understood, and in that silence, the structure that had seemed so certain at the beginning of the hearing revealed its weakness, not through force, not through defiance, but through something far more difficult to resist, clarity. And as Whitmore looked at Emma, again, truly seeing her now, not as a participant to be managed, but as someone who understood exactly where the system held and where it did not, it became clear that the control he believed he had never belonged entirely to him in the first place. And that realization settled into the room with a quiet finality that no statement could undo. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into every corner of the courtroom with a quiet authority that no one had expected. And Judge Whitmore remained still, his hand flat against the bench, his gaze fixed on the documents that now seemed to carry a weight far greater than paper and ink. Because they no longer supported his position, they challenged it, and for a moment, the man who had controlled every word in the room found himself measuring the consequences of the next one. The clerk shifted slightly, unsure whether to speak again, while the spectators, once passive observers, now leaned into the moment with a shared understanding that something irreversible had already taken place. And Emma stood where she had always been, calm, composed, unchanged, as if the shift in the room had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the truth finally being allowed to surface. Whitmore cleared his throat softly, the sound more human than authoritative. "The court acknowledges the discrepancy," he said, each word deliberate, carefully placed, as though constructing a new position in real time. "However, that does not automatically invalidate the proceedings." The statement attempted to reclaim ground, but it lacked the certainty that had defined his earlier tone. Emma responded without hesitation, her voice steady, precise. "It may not invalidate them entirely, Your Honor, but it does raise a question regarding the basis on which they were initiated." She paused briefly, allowing the logic to settle before continuing. "If the initiation lacks foundation, then the continuation requires justification." The structure of her argument unfolded with quiet inevitability, each step connected, each point grounded in the very principles the court was meant to uphold. And Whitmore's expression tightened again, not with dismissal, but with the recognition that he could no longer rely on assumption to carry the moment forward. "You are suggesting that this court has acted without proper basis," he said, the words slower now, more measured. Emma inclined her head slightly. "I am suggesting that the record should support the process, and where it does not, clarification becomes necessary." She did not accuse. She did not challenge authority directly. She simply placed the responsibility back where it belonged. And that subtle shift made all the difference, because it removed the possibility of framing her as defiant, leaving only the substance of what she was saying. The room remained silent, but the silence now carried clarity, not tension, and Whitmore leaned back again, his posture no longer signaling control, but consideration, his eyes moving briefly across the courtroom as if aware, perhaps for the first time, that the audience was no longer aligned with him by default, but was watching, evaluating, listening, and that awareness changed everything. "The court will review the procedural sequence in detail," he said finally, the words marking a departure from his earlier certainty. Emma nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reaction, without triumph, and in that restraint, there was a quiet power that no raised voice could have achieved, because she had not forced the moment. She had revealed it, step by step, until it could no longer be ignored. And as the judge turned back to the documents, no longer to confirm his position but to examine it, the balance in the room settled into something new, something grounded not in authority alone, but in accountability. And for everyone present, the realization was unmistakable. The hearing had changed, not through confrontation, but through precision. And the person who had once been expected to stand quietly and accept the outcome had instead become the one guiding how that outcome would be understood. The shift was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, and the courtroom, once shaped by assumption and hierarchy, now held a different kind of order, one that demanded alignment between process and truth. And Judge Whitmore sat, with that reality settling in, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, more deliberate, as he reviewed the documents again, this time not to confirm his authority, but to understand the gap that had been exposed. And the silence stretched, not empty, but focused, every eye in the room fixed on the bench, waiting not for dominance, but for clarity. And Emma remained still, her presence unchanged, neither pressing forward nor stepping back, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it should, without interference, without urgency. And Whitmore finally spoke, his voice measured, stripped of the earlier edge. "The court finds that the sequence of filings presents a material inconsistency." The words were careful, precise, chosen not to concede more than necessary, yet unable to deny what had already been established. A faint shift moved through the gallery, not a sound, but a shared recognition. And Emma's gaze remained steady, her expression neutral, as though the outcome was not a victory, but an expected conclusion. Whitmore continued, his tone steady but no longer absolute. "Given this inconsistency, the basis for initiating these proceedings requires reevaluation." The statement landed with quiet weight, marking a turning point that could not be reversed. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The room held in that suspended clarity, and then Emma spoke, her voice as calm as it had been from the beginning. "Thank you, Your Honor." The simplicity of the response carried no triumph, no emphasis, just acknowledgement. And that restraint defined the moment more than anything else, because it revealed that this had never been about winning. It had been about alignment, about ensuring that what was presented as process could withstand examination. Whitmore nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried more meaning than any earlier gesture of authority. "The court will dismiss the current action pending proper procedural review," he said, and the finality of that statement did not come from force, but from necessity. And as the words settled, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted once more, not with tension, but with release, the kind that follows resolution rather than dominance. Emma inclined her head slightly, her posture unchanged, and turned to step away from the stand, her movements quiet, unhurried, as though the attention of the room no longer belonged to her, but to what had just been understood. And behind her, Whitmore remained seated, his gaze following the documents rather than the woman who had just stood before him, as if recognizing that the lesson of the moment lay not in who she was, but in what had been revealed. And around them, the spectators began to shift, some exchanging glances, others simply sitting in silence, absorbing the quiet weight of what they had witnessed, because what had unfolded was not a confrontation, not a spectacle, but something far more lasting, a demonstration that authority, when separated from precision, does not hold, and that truth, when presented with clarity, does not need to raise its voice to be heard. And as Emma reached the doors and stepped into the hallway, beyond, the courtroom behind her remained still, held in a silence that no longer belonged to uncertainty, but to understanding. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than it should have, the kind of quiet that follows something people will think about long after they leave. And Emma Carter stepped forward with the same calm pace she had carried inside, her shoes making soft, measured sounds against the polished floor, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And behind her, the heavy wooden doors remained closed, holding within them a room that had been forced, for a brief moment, to confront something it did not expect, not rebellion, not disruption, but clarity. And inside that room, Judge Whitmore sat still, the documents resting in front of him no longer symbols of authority, but reminders of a process that had to be examined rather than assumed, his gaze fixed not on the outcome, but on the sequence that had led there. And for the first time in a long while, there was no immediate motion to the next case, no quick transition to restore momentum, only a pause, quiet and deliberate, as if even the structure of the day required a moment to recalibrate. And in the gallery, people began to rise slowly, some speaking in hushed tones, others remaining silent, their expressions thoughtful, reflective, because what they had witnessed was not a dramatic reversal, but something more lasting, a shift in understanding, a reminder that certainty without examination does not hold, and that the simplest questions, when asked with precision, can reshape even the most established authority. Emma reached the end of the hallway and paused briefly near a tall window, sunlight filtering in and casting a soft glow across the space. And for a moment, she stood there, not in contemplation, not in triumph, but in stillness, as if allowing the weight of the moment to settle before moving forward. Her phone remained silent in her bag, her expression unchanged, because there was no need to revisit what had already been resolved. The process had spoken for itself, and that was enough. And back inside, Whitmore finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his hand resting against the bench where it had once signaled control, now still, as though acknowledging that control, without precision, is only temporary. And the lesson, though unspoken, lingered in the room long after the hearing had ended, carried not by words, but by the absence of them. And as the next case was eventually called, the tone was different, quieter, more measured, as if something fundamental had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And outside, Emma resumed her walk, blending into the rhythm of the day, unnoticed by most, unremarkable in appearance, yet carrying with her the quiet truth that had just reshaped an entire room, a truth that did not need recognition to exist. And as she stepped into the sunlight and continued forward, the world around her moved as it always had, unaware that, for a brief moment, dignity had stood in the center of authority and been neither raised nor defended, only revealed. And that was what remained, long after everything else had returned to normal.